Who doesn't love to style a good web form? I know I sure don't. So in this tutorial, we're going to be learning how to style a web form. We're going to be adding some CSS animations. We're going to be adding some fancy little label tricks. And then it's a two-part series. In the second part, we're going to be doing the JavaScript to validate the form, as well as add all of the fancy user interface for the error messages in green and red, and some nice little user experience to the form. So follow along, let's get started. Right, the first step here is just to add in our HTML. Now I'm in the editor VS Code. So if you're in that editor, you can just go ahead and open up a blank HTML document and save it, and type doc and hit tab, and it will fill out the boilerplate HTML for you. Now we're gonna come down here to the body section, and you're gonna basically copy this line. This is image script. So I'm gonna have a container, then a form, and then a thing called form group, 4 of those, a label, and then a form label. As soon as you type all that out, you can go ahead and hit tab. Whoops, so let me just back this up, hit tab, and it will go ahead and fill out all the HTML for this. So this will give us most of our boilerplate code, and let's go ahead and fancy it up a little bit from here. So the first thing I'm gonna do, just so it's a little bit easier to read, I'm going to reformat here and kind of put this in a little bit different format. So we'll have our div there, and then we have a label. And inside of each label, we're gonna have an input. So this first one is gonna be a type of text. This will be like our name. So we're gonna pretend this is like a contact form that the user would fill out just with a few fields here for this sample. And the class of this input field is going to be form control. And we'll go ahead and give it an ID of name. And we'll give it a name attribute of name, which will become the variable. And we're gonna give a placeholder value of Jane Doe or something. This would be the placeholder. And then we'll say tab index equals 1. So this will be the first item that's tabbed to if the user is using the keyboard. And then we're going to say required to make this form field required. Okay, now that's a lot of code. I'm going to go ahead and do my line wrap there so you can kind of see that wrap down, and I'll pull this over just here for a minute. And let's go ahead and save and get this guy previewed. Okay, you can see now over here in the right-hand side, I've got my form. Now I'm just gonna hit Command plus, whoops, wrong side here. Just to zoom in a little bit over here while we're mocking this up, you can see these appear. So that's pretty much it. Now this label for tag, this one's going to be for the name. Remember, the for attribute has to match with the name attribute. So this and this have to be the same. Okay, so that looks pretty good for our first form group. And let's go ahead and add in an actual label here. We'll just call this your name. So we have our label and our input field. That's looking great. So I'm just going to copy this input field and kind of do the same thing down here. Let's just reformat this a little bit. And I'm just going to paste that one. So for this second one, we're going to have this be our email. So the input type is going to be email. That's the new HTML5 input type that automatically has the validation built in. And so ID will just say email, name, email. Then same thing here for the label, we'll just say your email, and then for is gonna be for email. So tab index, we want this to be 2, and for the placeholder text, we'll just say jane@doe.com. So again, the placeholder text is the little text that appears in the field, but as soon as you click into a field and start to type, the placeholder text disappears. Now, where we're eventually headed with this is what we're gonna do is we're gonna make it so when we click in here, the placeholder text animates up and becomes the label. So we're gonna do a couple little tricks. So our label is actually going to be hidden inside over the top of the field, and it's gonna animate up. So that's the way we'll kind of eventually build this out. Okay, next let's just do the same thing down here. We'll just add one more input field here, and this one's going to be like the subject. If this was a contact form, we're gonna have the subject. So we'll say this one is going to be for subject, and we'll call this subject, ID, subject, name, subject, and placeholder. We'll just say, hello there, something like that. Okay, let's save and make sure that one's there. So there's our subject. And then our last one needs to be a text area because the user is going to type in a message here. So this one will still have a label. However, it's not going to be an input field, it's going to be a text area. So we'll go ahead and add in the text area. And this one is going to be Rows, we'll just say 5. So this is basically how many rows of text. And then columns, this actually doesn't really matter because we're going to be changing the width here with CSS in a little minute, but we'll just put this in here for now. So that gives us a little input field there. Now we'll also give this guy an ID. We'll just call this the message, and we'll give it a name attribute of message. And we'll go ahead and save that. And we need some placeholder text in here as well. So for the placeholder text, we'll just say enter message ... Okay, so there's our little placeholder text there. Now let's go ahead and add our label. So this is going to be message for message. Save. Okay, so we have our basic form laid out. The only thing we're now missing is a submit button. So we'll just add this down here in this last row. We'll just do this one as a button. Type equals submit. And we'll just call this send message or something like that with an exclamation point. So now we are able to send the form. That looks good. And everything else is great. Now up here on our form tag, we just have action set to blank because we're not actually submitting the data here, of course. But we could also set this method to post or whatever we want. We could give this an ID as well. But that should, let's just give it a class of form in case we want to style some things on the actual form tag. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the HTML markup. Now we do need to fix our tab indexes. So this one's 1. This one is tab index 2. So this one should be 3. Whoops. And then that should do it right there. Whoops, we need to add one down here. We'll give this one here a tab index of 4. Now what that does again, if the user comes over here and they hit tab, it determines which section the browser jumps to next. And so we want that to sort of follow down in the logical sequence there. That will help with accessibility. So that's it. So this is our HTML, and you can kind of see how this is grouped, where we have this main container div. Inside of that, we have our main form. And then each of our sort of input fields is just separated by a single div. So we have a div and we call that form group, div form group. And then lastly, just our submit button in the message there. So that does it for the HTML. Now let's jump over to the CSS and we'll begin to style it. So I want my form tag to kind of sit in the center of the page. So we're going to use Flexbox for that. So what I'm going to do is directly on the body tag, I'm actually going to set that to display flex. And that will allow me to position the child, which I have this single container. This container is going to be able to be centered. So we'll say justify-content center, and we'll say align items center. This is going to center horizontally and vertical. I'm going to set the height on the body tag to 100 viewport height units. So the body essentially stretches as tall as the screen is. And then let's just set a font family, whatever font family you want, right? It really doesn't matter. Of course, if you don't have these fonts installed, it's not going to matter. But you can set any font you want if you're doing your font embedding. And we'll just go ahead and say any sans serif fonts. Okay, so that should do it there. Now let's go ahead and add in our container. So the container is that master div. Whoops, it has a class of container. And we'll just give this guy right now a width of like, I don't know, 600 pixels or something, just so we can see this start to work. Now I'm hitting save and I'm looking over here waiting for something to change. Nothing is changing because I don't have my CSS and my HTML file links together yet. So I need to come up here to my head section and link them up. So let's go ahead and add a link tag up here. Link rel equals style sheet. And we're going to say the href equals webform.css, whatever the name of your CSS file is. And then we'll say media equals all. And that should do it there. There we go. And as soon as I got that linking, you can see that's now centering itself. So just so we can see this, I'm going to add a little outline on the container temporarily. Actually, maybe I'll just give it a background color. And something really light, like a DDD or something. Okay, so you can see kind of how that's working there. I'm going to zoom out. Whoops, wrong screen. I'm going to zoom out over here just a click or two. So you can see it's definitely set to a 600 pixel width. Maybe for this example, I'm going to break that down to 500 just so it's a little bit easier to see. And it's centered horizontally and vertically. So that's looking fine for now. Okay, So the next thing we're going to do is start to style out all of our form elements. Now, form elements are notorious for being difficult to style, I think, in CSS. A lot of browsers don't support certain things. But one of the problems is that the labels and the input fields themselves are both, you can see they're inline sort of to one another, this label. So I need to kind of break those up to make this appear a little bit better. So we are going to be working with our form group. Now, form group, you'll recall, is that div tag that surrounds each form element. So the only thing we're going to do here, we'll play with this in a minute, we're just set the margin bottom to like 1.5 ems, just so they're kind of spaced out a little bit. They don't bump up against one another so easily. And that'll be fine for now. Next, let's work on the actual label, which is in a class called form label. I think that's what we gave that guy. Yep, so each of these labels has a class of form label. So on our label fields here, we can set our font size to 0.75 em. Now, this seems really small for the label, and that's because we're going to be animating the label up above that in a little while. So we want it to kind of be a little bit smaller than the actual input field. And let's go ahead and set a color here. Right now, I'm just going to set this color as red, and we'll be changing these in a minute. So because I don't know my colors, I'm actually going to set up some CSS variables. So up here, let's add a root element. So we'll just set our first variable maybe as dash dash, I don't know, font color. It's kind of a bad name, but that'll work. And we'll just set it to red for now. And then let's come down here, and instead of declaring this red, let's call this one variable font dash color. Okay, so it's going to work the same way, but then when I get a lot of these colors going, I can just change it right up here. And of course, that will propagate, if I could type that correctly, that'll propagate down through. So that'll work for now. So we've got that color in place. Next, let's go ahead and change the display. So we're going to change these guys to be display block. This way, the label appears above the actual form element. You can see like so. And we will set the opacity to 1. Now, opacity we'll use later if we do a little bit of animation or something to hide or show these elements. And that's pretty much all we need there on the form label. So let's now come down here to the form control. Now, recall that the form control is on the actual inputs of the form. So we'll style those next. So form control. And on these guys, we're going to give them it's kind of a little bit tricky here, but by default, form elements, the input fields themselves are styled slightly different between all the web browsers. But by default, they kind of have a border, they have a shadow, and a few things like that, depending on if they're highlighted or not. You can see that in some outlines. So we kind of want to get rid of all that stuff because we're going to be custom styling our form. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to set the border. Actually, we're going to set box shadow to none. That's will be the first thing we do. And what that does is it kind of gets rid of this shadow that's going to be highlighting those elements. And then we're going to set our border dash color to, actually, let's do these in order. So it's size, and then, so we'll do these in the order. So we're going to set the border radius to 0. They do have a slight radius on the corner. You really can't see there. But we're going to set the border radius to 0. And then we're going to set the border dash color to, we'll just set this to CCC for now. And then we're going to set the border dash style. And we're going to do this on 4 sides. Whoops. So we're going to set none, none, solid, none. Now, this is top, right, bottom, left. So the top border is none, the right border is none, the bottom border is solid, and the left border is none. And you can kind of see what's happening now. So I've got this little underline here only on one specific side. So that's looking pretty good. In other words, I have a bottom border and nothing else. That's kind of what that's doing for us. Next, we can set the width here to 100% because I want them to stretch and fill up the entire container there. And that's looking great. And then let's go ahead and change the font size. So we'll say maybe 1.25 ems. And that's looking pretty good. Now I did not give, you can see how my text area did not change. So I need to come back to my HTML. I think I forgot to add the class of form control on it. Let's double check. So my text area, yeah, it does not. So I'll add in the class of form control so that it also gets those same styles. Okay, perfect. Now that's looking pretty good here. So let's go ahead and style up this submit button at the bottom. So that one is going to be .btn. So let's go ahead and give this guy a class. Right now it's just a simple button, but let's give it a class of btn for button. And then we can hook into that and style it. So this guy, we're going to do quite a bit of CSS here to make it look much more like we want. So we're going to give it a background, and we're going to say 0, 0, and then we'll just say white. So it's going to have a white background here. And then we're going to give it a border of 1 pixel solid. And again, here for the color, maybe we'll say DDD. Let's actually go a little bit darker, AAA, just for a minute here. And then we're going to give it a border dash radius of 3 pixels to kind of round those corners a little bit more. Then we're going to give it a color, and we're going to make the color here of this just our same variable up here for our color of the text, right? Our label color. And then let's go ahead and give it a font size of, I don't know, 1M or something like that, which would be 16 pixels in our case, to make it a little bit bigger. And let's give it a padding. We need to pad that out. So on the top and bottom, we'll say 10 pixels. On the left and right, we'll say 50. So that gives it a little bit more padding to make the button much more bigger and noticeable. Let's do a text transform and set that to uppercase so that we get a complete uppercase text there. I'll keep scrolling down here. And that's pretty good for the button. Now let's go ahead and add a hover state. So we're going to say .btn:hover. So this is our pseudo selector. And we're just going to change the border color to something that's different. Let's set this up in another variable. So we'll say font hover dash color. Okay, now let's go set this one up. So I'll copy this and we'll set this one, I don't know, to blue for now. Should work fine. Okay, so we can see that happening there when we hover over the top. Whoops, did I? Oh yeah, I just copied and pasted. What did we call this guy? Font hover color. So let's fix that up here. This variable should be called font hover color. There we go. Okay, so that now hovers over, so that's looking pretty fine there. And let's go ahead and also change the color. And we're just going to do the same thing. So when we hover, the outline and the text will both change colors. So that'll work fine for our little button there. So that is hovering and looking pretty good. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this little gray that we set up. That was just temporary. So I'm going to come over here and remove that background color on my container and save. So we kind of have this feeling going now. Now this is kind of a new, well, I don't know, it's been around for a while, but whenever you add a text area, you can grab this corner and resize it. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want to give that ability here. So what we need to do is we're just going to come down here and write a general rule for the text area. And we're going to turn off the resize. And to do that, you just say resize none. And that will get rid of that little resize thing, not allowing the user to resize that element. Okay, so that's looking much better. There's our contact form. Now let's fix up the colors a little bit. For our default color, I'm just going to set this to maybe, I don't know, 999 maybe. Kind of a light gray. That's probably a little light. Maybe let's go with 555. That looks fine. And then when we hover, let's go ahead and just, I don't know, make them orange for now. Let's see if that's working. Okay, so that's working fine there. Perfect. So one thing you'll notice is that the placeholder text itself, I think, is a little bit too dark. So we can actually modify the placeholder text as well. So let's change that as well. I'll add a new rule here under our form control. I'll say .form control, and then it's going to be the placeholder pseudo selector. Allows you to modify that, and I can just simply change the color to I don't know, maybe AAA. There we go. That's a little bit better, so they're not so dark. Okay, that's looking much, much better. Next thing we want to do is go ahead and get rid of this giant. You see when I select a field, in other words, when the field has focus, I get this big giant blue border. And I want to get rid of that by default because I'm going to end up customizing that myself. And when we add in all of the animation and things like that to do our validation in the second part, we want to be able to customize those colors. So let's get rid of them by default. That is just going to be done with the form-control and the focus pseudo selector. So when it has focus, we're going to just take that box shadow property and turn it off. And we're going to change the border color to our hover variable. So the font color for hover. So I'll copy this and paste this over here. Okay, and then on our focus here, we're going to also set the outline to none. So outline is a property that gets applied to form elements when they're focused. That's what gives it that big blue sort of glow. But now you can see when I click in here, each time I click into one of these, it goes ahead and gives me that color, right? So it's kind of like a hover state. You can see as I tab through these. That's kind of how that's working. So that's looking much, much better there. And then of course, we're going to be styling these with some error messages, and they'll turn green or red depending on if it's valid or not. But that is the basic form setup for our HTML and CSS. So that is it for this first part. In the second part, if you want to continue the series, we're going to be adding the JavaScript to do the validation. We're going to be animating all of the states, as well as adding some user experience for the animation on the input fields for valid versus invalid. So join part 2, stay tuned, like, subscribe, click the thumbs up, all that good stuff. We'll see you in the next one.